There are places in the American West where the land remembers, not in any way that can be measured or recorded in the ledgers of reasonable men, but in the way that silence settles differently over certain ground, the way the wind behaves strangely around structures that have no business still standing, the way a man finds himself slowing his pace without quite knowing why, as though something beneath his feet is asking him to pay attention. Piedmont, Wyoming is such a place. Ride out into the high desert of Uintah County today, and you will find them. 3 stone beehive kilns rising from the scrubland, like the remnants of some ancient and half-forgotten civilization. They are roughly 30 feet tall, these structures, built from native stone with a precision that the wilderness around them does nothing to explain. No town surrounds them. No voices carry across the sage. The railroad grade that once ran alongside them has returned to earth. The buildings that once stood here, the hotel, the saloons, the modest homes of working families, have been swallowed so completely by time and weather that the ground itself gives almost no indication they existed at all. Only the kilns remain. And they have been standing there, alone, since the world that built them walked away and did not come back. That world was real once. In the late 1860s, when the Union Pacific Railroad was driving iron across Wyoming territory, with a ferocity that the land itself seemed to resist, Piedmont was a living, breathing place. The railroad required charcoal, enormous, unrelenting quantities of it, to fuel the foundries and machine shops that kept the Great Westward Project moving. The kilns were the answer to that demand. They were constructed around 1869, built by men whose names history did not trouble itself to preserve. From stone pulled out of the same country that surrounded them, shaped into domes that could sustain fires burning at temperatures that would humble most modern industry. The men who worked those kilns were not celebrated men. They were laborers, many of them immigrants, newly arrived in a country whose language they were still learning, sent to a remote station in a Wyoming desert to cut timber from the nearby mountains, feed it into stone chambers, and tend the slow, controlled burn that turned wood into the charcoal the railroad consumed without gratitude or pause. They lived in Piedmont through winters that arrived early and stayed late, through summers that offered heat without mercy, in a settlement so remote that the railroad itself was both their lifeline and their warden. The train brought what they needed and carried away what they produced. And beyond that, Piedmont was whatever the men inside it made of it. And then, as these places do, it began to empty. The railroad's appetite for charcoal declined as the technology feeding it changed. The foundries found other fuels. The reason for Piedmont's existence quietly evaporated, the way reasons do when industry moves on and leaves its infrastructure behind. Families packed what they could carry. The hotel closed. The saloons went dark. The post office, which had given the settlement its only formal acknowledgement of existence, eventually ceased operations. One by one, the structures that men had built against the Wyoming wilderness surrendered to it, and the wilderness accepted everything back without ceremony. Everything except the kilns. They did not fall. They did not crumble in any meaningful way. They stood through the decades that followed with a stubbornness that seems almost deliberate in retrospect. 3 stone domes in open country, outlasting every human thing that had been built alongside them, as though they had decided that their work was not yet finished, or their story not yet fully told. Those who have spent time near the kilns at the hour when the light fails speak of the place in ways that careful men choose their words carefully to describe. The silence out there is not the comfortable silence of empty country. It carries a quality that visitors consistently struggle to name, a density, a texture, as though the air itself is occupied by something that observation cannot quite resolve into form. The wind moves through the stone openings of the kilns and produces sounds that stop just short of being voices. Shadows pool inside the dome chambers in ways that the angle of the light does not entirely account for. A man standing at the mouth of one of those kilns and looking into its interior is looking into a space where fire burned continuously for years, where the heat was so sustained and so intense that the stone walls absorbed it the way memory absorbs experience, completely, permanently, in ways that alter the very structure of the thing that received it. What the stone holds now, in the long cold years since the last fire died, is a question that science answers one way, and the country around Piedmont suggests another. The men who built these structures are gone. The men who worked them are gone. The town that grew up around them to make that work possible is gone so thoroughly that a man walking the ground today would need to know what he was looking for before the earth gave up even the faintest suggestion of what once stood there. The railroad that gave Piedmont its reason for existing runs different routes now, indifferent to what it left behind in the Wyoming desert a century and a half ago. But the kilns stand. They stand in the same ground, under the same sky, in the same silence that has been deepening around them since the last resident of Piedmont looked back over his shoulder and rode away. They ask no one's permission to remain. They make no accounting of what they have witnessed across the long years of their solitude. They simply endure, patient, stone, and profoundly, unutterably still. And on certain evenings, when the light drops below the ridgeline and the temperature falls with the particular suddenness that the Wyoming high desert reserves for the hours between day and dark, the smoke that rises from the ground around those kilns carries no fire to explain it. It simply rises, as it always has, as though the work inside never truly stopped.